All right, class, so this is all about federalism. So just like chapter 2, the Constitution, federalism, chapter 3 is a big chapter with a lot in it. So remember to use these videos as an overview of the chapters to help you prepare for class, right? Remember to use your textbook and note taker to dig deeper into some of the concepts. All right, so some things that you need to know from this chapter: different government systems, powers that are located in the Constitution between federal and state governments, amendments, and federalism, kind of how they work together, the role of the Supreme Court in modifying this, all right, and money, because, well, that's kind of how the federal government controls us. All right, so let's look at the government structure. So federalism, right? It's a system where local government units can make final decisions regarding some activities, all right, and they are protected, versus the unitary system where local governments are subservient to the national government. Okay, so two totally kind of different systems there. All right, so federalism. Now remember that there's some hot issues out there, okay, which challenge the idea of federalism. So hottest issues in American politics at their core, right, really push this concept of who has the power, the state or the national government. So some of these are gay marriage, medical marijuana, Obamacare, also known as the Affordable Care Act, and immigration enforcement. All right, so remember, it's the relationship overall, all right, of the national, all right, and the state governments. How are these two entities going to engage with each other? Who's going to hold the power over certain issues? All right, and that's kind of at the core of this chapter. So federal and state powers. All right, generally speaking, federal government has a power over economic issues, all right, military and defense. Okay, that's the federal government. Whereas state governments, okay, are going to have the power over social, moral, and family issues. However, there's some blending of these lines sometimes. All right, so the different types of powers that are used. There's the exclusive federal power, right? This is just reserved solely for the national government, right? What the Constitution gives to the national government is the national government's power. All right, there is concurrent or shared powers exercised by both the state and the national governments, right? Like tax, all right? The federal government and the state governments both have the power to tax us, which is why we have a federal income tax and a state income tax, okay? And then there's reserved powers, all right? These are left to the states, all right, because of the 10th Amendment. The 10th Amendment states anything not directly and explicitly given to the federal government in the Constitution lies with the state and the people. There's a bunch of positives and negatives to this, right? The negative is that federalism can block progress, all right, and it can protect its own interests, okay? The positive view is that federalism contributes to government strength, all right, political flexibility. It fosters individual liberty, all right? And now if we think back to Federalist number 10, remember, small political units allow all relevant issues or interests to be heard, right? So like the idea that factions cannot take over, all people will have a voice. All right, so there's some relationships between states, okay? So just like the federal government has a relationship with states, states also have a relationship with states, okay? One of the big ones is the full faith and credit clause, all right? It requires states to recognize the public acts and legal judgments of other states, okay? So it's in the Constitution. If you commit a crime in one state, you flee to the other state, okay, that state has to return you so that you can be tried for the crime committed, all right? So full faith and credit clause. All right, the Privileges and Immunities Clause. This requires states to offer out-of-state citizens the same treatment as in-state residents, okay? So like your driver's license, all right, you get it in Colorado, it's still valid in Massachusetts under the Privileges and Immunities Clause, okay? And then extradition. All right, the idea that this is a process, right, like I kind of mentioned earlier, where a state has to return a person, all right, being charged with a crime in another state. Okay, again, extradition falling under the full faith and credit. All right, so let's look at federalism over time. There's two types, all right, and generally they're referred to as a cake. And if we were actually in person, I would let you make cakes and talk about the federalism over time here. But anyway, dual federalism. Okay, it's the idea that both national and state governments are supreme in their own spheres. Okay, this keeps them separate. Okay, and slowly we get a comparative federalism whereby the state and the federal spheres overlap and distinctions between them kind of become blurred. All right. This is also known as American federalism. So definitely know that cooperative federalism and American federalism are interchangeable, and it is the overlapping and blurring of these state and federal spheres. Okay. So let's dig a little deeper, right? One is a layered cake, dual federalism. Everything is separate. This is national, this is state, and this is local. No ifs, ands, or buts. There's division. Then there's the cooperative or American federalism, okay? Considered the marble cake. The idea that things are starting to merge together, they're blending together, there's some overlap in there. All right, so money rules, folks. Categorical grants versus revenue sharing. Okay, this is complex. All right, this is important to understand. And this is definitely a time, well, I will say definitely refer to your book and the note taker to be sure you really understand all of these, okay? So categorical grants are for specific purposes, all right? It's defined by federal law, all right? They require local governments to match certain funds, okay, frequently. So project grants are based on competitive applications, right? So you apply for a grant to build something. When you get that money, you have to spend it on that project. You can't just be like, I decided not to do that, so I'm going to spend the money over here. Not how it works, okay? All right, then there's formula grants. These are based on a formula, right? So maybe it's something about roads. So Boston is going to get more money, right, than Cheyenne because it's got more roads to deal with, all right, versus Cheyenne does, okay? Okay. Then we're going to get something called the devolution of power. So the devolution occurs when the federal government gives more authority, all right, and discretion to state governments over what to do. Okay. This has come in the form of block grants. Okay, block grants are devoted to a general purpose and have fewer restrictions than a categorical grant, right? Categorical grant, you have to spend it on that topic, all right, and a certain way. Block grants, that's a general purpose. There's fewer restrictions. So like welfare, Medicaid, all right, things like that. Revenue sharing requires no matching funds and can be spent on almost any governmental purpose. Okay, so revenue sharing. All right. All right, let's look at kind of federal control, right? There's this thing called fiscal federalism. All right. It's the use of federal taxing and spending, which impacts the states through grants and aids. Okay. So remember, the grant and aid is the federal money provided to states to implement a public policy objective. Okay, so fiscal federalism. So the conditions of that aid usually tells the state governments what they must do if they wish to receive grant money, right? So you must raise the drinking age to 21 in order to get the highway funding. Okay, that was a huge example of this. All right, and then there's going to be something called mandates. Mandates are federal rules that states or localities must obey, usually having little to do with the federal aid. Okay. So, for example, like an unfunded mandate occurs when a state must comply with a federal law but are not given any funds to do so. All right. And an example of this is Americans with Disabilities Act. Congress passes the law and then says, hey, all buildings need to be handicapped accessible, at which point there's no money behind that. The states have to come up with the money to figure out how to fix stairways, elevators, etc. Okay, federalism and the Constitution. So it's all about the 10th Amendment, right? Whereby it states that all power not given to the national government, all right, or prohibited to states is thereby reserved to the states and the people. But Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution allows Congress to make all laws necessary and proper for carrying out its enumerated powers. Okay, so enumerated powers declared specifically in the Constitution. All right, Article 1, Section 8 says they can pass any law necessary and proper for them to do that. That's oftentimes controversial, and we will see how the Supreme Court will begin to slowly interpret their use of the necessary and proper clause. So let's look at the Marshall Court. If you took APUSH, you hopefully know and remember John Marshall, rather important guy. Let's look at some of his decisions. So as the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, he had some important decisions, one of which was the McCulloch v. Maryland decision. Okay. The question was, could Congress charter a national bank? All right. And Marshall says, indeed they can. Yes, even though this power is not explicitly in the Constitution, Congress does have the power to do that. Okay, the next question before the court was, can states tax the national bank? Marshall Court says no, because the power to tax is the power to destroy. The idea is the federal government has the power to charter a bank. The states cannot touch that bank. They cannot put fees on that bank. They cannot tax that bank. It is a federal entity. Okay. So let's look at ways that we're going to continue to increase national power, all right, from Marshall onwards. So there's going to be a case, Gibbons v. Ogden, 1824, whereby the court is going to define commerce very broadly, okay, to include all intercourse between states. So any relationship between states regarding commerce, all right, and sales or anything like that, Congress can kind of oversee, all right. 1824, Gibbons v. Ogden. All right, another example is the Heart of Atlanta Motel. Okay, this is not technically a federalism case, but the court does uphold that the Civil Rights Act passed by Congress in 1964, underneath the Commerce Clause, all right, is valid, and that that kind of really expands the power of Congress, right? Because they're telling a motel underneath the Commerce Clause, hey, you have to open up your doors to blacks and whites, okay? So this is a huge expanse of federal power. All right, so let's look at some current court challenges that kind of deal with this. Okay, so by the last quarter of the 20th century, federal power had expanded significantly, reducing the power of states, okay, until this case. All right, U.S. v. Lopez. So the question is, does Congress have the power to legislate public schools? Using the Commerce Clause is anything that deals with economics and trade, right? So definitely understand that. Economics and trade is underneath the Commerce Clause. So our actions on school grounds within the powers of Congress? Well, they passed a law saying that it was, okay? And when you look at it, their ability to defend the Commerce Clause and that law is pretty thin, okay? The courts are going to say no. There is no commerce taking place on a public school grounds. Therefore, Congress had no power to pass the Gun-Free School Zones Act, right? And they declared it unconstitutional because they passed that law, embedding it underneath the Commerce Clause, okay, to expand over schools. And the court says, no, there is no commerce taking place on schools, therefore you can't pass a law like that. Now, it doesn't mean states can't pass said laws, okay? And states do actually pass those laws. But the federal government overreached its power in U.S. v. Lopez. So let's look at the same-sex marriage, all right? And marriage just over time, really. So first we have Loving v. Virginia in 1967. This is going to declare that states cannot prohibit interracial marriage. Okay, 1967, this is big. Then we're going to have U.S. v. Windsor in 2013. And the court's going to declare that the section of the Defense of Marriage Act classifying only opposite-sex marriages as legal under federal law was unconstitutional. It could not make such a classification. Okay, this validated state-recognized same-sex marriages for federal purposes, right? This said that federally, we can't classify what and who marriage is. So therefore, the federal government's hands are out of it. So states can kind of manage that. Okay, but then we're going to have Oberfell v. Hodges, and it's going to affirm the right of all couples to marry, all right, and that all states must recognize per the full faith and credit clause. Okay, so we're kind of expanding states' powers, then we're kind of bringing back the federal powers, all right, and then we're saying, hey, everybody needs to play ball the same way. Because after the 2013 ruling, some states were legalizing same-sex marriage. Some states weren't legalizing same-sex marriage. Some states thereby weren't recognizing same-sex marriages conducted in other states. Oberfell says you can't do that. If one state allows it, everybody has to recognize it. All based under the full faith and credit clause of the Constitution. All right, so let's look at marijuana. We have Gonzalez v. Rake, okay, 2005. The court is going to rule against Rake, all right, and side with the authority of the federal government and the power of Congress under the Commerce and Supremacy Clause. So the idea is that she was growing medical marijuana, all right, because she was prescribed medical marijuana. She was arrested by the Federal Department of Drug Enforcement agency, and so she challenged that and said, but California has legalized this, so I have a right to do this, right? And the Supreme Court in this decision said, nope, federal law oversees that state law. You were breaking the law, okay? So let's think of our state. We legalized marijuana here in Colorado, recreation and medical, okay? Thereby challenging the federal law, all right, of the Controlled Substance Act of 1970. Okay, so two states are going to challenge this. Nebraska and Oklahoma are going to attempt to take Colorado to the Supreme Court, all right, by arguing that because we legalized marijuana in our state, there has been a surge of marijuana coming into Nebraska and Oklahoma from Colorado. But the Supreme Court refused to take this up. Okay, leaving the dispute kind of hanging there, all right, kind of biding their time, maybe waiting for new justices to come in, but kind of saying, you know what, states and federal governments, you need to figure this one out, and somebody needs to give and take here. And it's not going to be the courts right now. All right. Okay, so update your slides, get everything into your notes, be sure that you have your vocabulary and you are ready for class, and until next time.